Welcome. It's so great to see so many of you out here today. Welcome to our event. My name is Jamie Jacobson. I'm the director of the Center for Science Communication here at CSU, and I'm just so honored to have you here for our spotlight on inclusive science communication today. We have a wonderful guest speaker, Dr. Mónica Feliú-Mójer, who is here with us from San Diego to give a presentation using culturally relevant science communication to engage marginalized communities. I'd like to say a few words about her background, but before I do, I want to take a moment to give a few shout outs of thanks. First to the College of Liberal Arts. Mónica is here with us today because of the Ann Gill Visiting Lecturer and Artist grant, so thank you so much for the support to have her with us. I would also like to thank our Department of Journalism and Media Communication for their support, everyone who is involved in our Center for Science Communication and our Science Communication Club, thank you. And without further ado, to introduce our guest. Dr. Mónica Feliú-Mójer is a bilingual science communicator who taps into her training. She's a PhD in neurobiology, her personal background, and culture. She's a woman from a rural working class community in Puerto Rico to engage historically underserved and overlooked audiences, especially Puerto Ricans and other Spanish speakers, with science. She has more than 17 years of experience in multimedia science communication, community engagement, media relations, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Dr. Feliú-Mójer serves as the Director of Communications for Ciencia Puerto Rico, the Director of Inclusive Science Communication for the Science Communication Lab. She's also a producer for the Wonder Collaborative. She is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and serves on the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine Standing Committee on Advancing Science Communication. All right, without further ado, please, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you, Jamie. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jamie. Thank you to the College of Liberal Arts for having me, to the Center for Science Communication, and everyone who was involved in organizing this and making sure I have a smooth and lovely visit. Thank you, y'all, for coming and joining me. I'm looking forward to our conversation. So I'm going to talk about culturally relevant science communication. I'm going to use, there's some feedback. I'm going to use some of my own work and the work of others to provide some examples and principles and strategies that hopefully you'll be able to apply to your work. If you are, I'm happy if you want to take pictures of my slides, or if you want to share something on Twitter. I feel like people are mostly not doing Twitter because it's on fire, like more so than always. But if you want to share what I'm saying on Twitter, I'm happy to have you do that. And I'm a neuroscientist by training. And when I was a bench researcher, I used to study synaptic connections between neurons, and what regulated that process of synaptic transmission. And so I love this image. This is a picture of a fly brain, and what you're seeing is a bunch of different neurons that are fluorescently labeled, and you can see some of the connections between the neurons. And I love this image because it's beautiful. It reminds me of my old work, although I worked with worms, which are just way cooler. But it actually makes me think of what I do today. As a science communicator, as a community engager, what I do is think about connections, but connections between people. How do I connect science with the culture, the identities, the realities of my audience? And so I have a question for you. What makes you feel connected to science? What makes science meaningful to you, whether you're a scientist or not? And you can just shout out. What comes up when I ask these questions? Yes?
I guess it's like a way to understand the world.
A way.
So it makes me feel connected to the world I live in.
Okay, a way to understand the world and makes you feel connected to the world. What else? Stories. So a hand in the back. What it's relevant to your life. What else? Yes?
It seems like a common language.
Common language. All right. Anything else? All right, I'll tell you about some of the things that make science meaningful to me. The beach, lizards, cows, and farmers. And these things all have to do with Puerto Rico, where I was born and raised and where a lot of my work happens today. And why do I share this? Well, because being born and raised in Puerto Rico, that really shaped my culture. It shaped who I am. And culture, like that collection of experience, of identities, of values, of beliefs, of previous knowledge, all of those things, they influence what we do, just what we're interested in. And in this particular case, how we understand and engage with science. And I was born and raised in a rural community in northern Puerto Rico. This was one of my cows growing up. Her name was Carla. She's no longer with us. But this was the environment where I grew up in. I grew up surrounded by animals, by nature, and that really fostered an interest in biology and science. But I didn't know that. Moreover, I didn't know that I could be a scientist because science really felt distant, it felt foreign, it felt irrelevant to my reality because so many of the references of who does science, where science is done, were very distant to my own reality. And this was true in school, in media, in books, everywhere. I did not see references that align with my identities and my experiences. And this is an image from a show that I actually loved watching. I think it's made a comeback. There's a lot of these like white men science shows that are making comebacks. But this was called Big Man's World, and Big Man was the scientist, and he was the stereotypical scientist. Crazy hair, white man, lab coat. He had a girl who was a helper. He had a rat. I couldn't identify with either of them. And this show was produced in English. It was dubbed in Spanish, and their Spanish didn't sound like mine. It sounded like foreign Spanish. So even though I was seeing science or a depiction of science, this wasn't resonating with me. And unfortunately, this is true for many different audiences, particularly for folks that have been historically and are currently marginalized and overlooked and oppressed by science. And before I move on, I want to say, when I gave you kind of the definition that I use for culture, that's very broad. And I want to say everybody has culture. Sometimes when we think about culture, we think about a foreign culture or a culture of an ethnic group or a racial group of others. But the reality is everybody has culture. What happens is that in science and science communication, the dominant culture is white, is Western, is male, and it's of the global north, meaning the United States, Canada, Europe, Australia. And so everybody has culture. White people have culture. Here in the United States, it just happens to be normal. It's the norm. And so because this is true, anyone who doesn't fit that culture, those cultural expectations and written and unwritten rules, if you don't fit that, then you're outside. You are othered, and you're marginalized and overlooked from both science and science communication. That's a big problem. We're excluding a big group of people. We're missing a lot of knowledge and a lot of perspectives. There's so many communities that we're not engaging. But culturally relevant science communication is a tool. It offers us ways to address some of these challenges in science and in science communication and make it more equitable and inclusive. And what do I mean when I talk about culturally relevant science communication? Well, I'm talking about communication that leverages the cultural knowledge, the prior experiences, and the identities of an audience to make science relevant to them. It's communication that makes science pertinent to the things that people care about, to the way that they live, to the things that they know and they care about. So it brings science closer to them and to who they are. And it opens up to certain conversations that we're not having if we don't take culture into account. And what are some of the things that culturally relevant science communication needs to take into account? What are some cultural elements that we need to take into account when we're thinking about our audiences? In communication, I probably don't have to say this, but it bears repeating, it's all about the audience. You have to center your audience. And so you have to think about many of their different identities and aspects. You have to think about their socioeconomic status, their geography, where do they live? What are their identities? What languages do they speak? What are their values, their beliefs, their previous knowledge? What are the things that they already know that you can build upon in your communication and your engagement with them? I'm not gonna lie, this is not easy to do. It's continuous work. It requires active reflection and reflexivity. And it also requires a recognition of inequities, particularly if you're working with communities that are marginalized, or you're working with communities that are not your own. You need to recognize those inequities. You also need to have empathy, and you need to have humility. The humility to recognize the things you don't know, the humility to say you're sorry when you mess up, because it's not a matter of if, but when you will mess up. And it requires also self-awareness of your positionality. You know, how do people see you because of your gender presentation, the color of your skin, what languages you speak, do you have an accent or not? All of those things affect how people perceive us and how we build relationships with people. So there needs to be a lot of self-awareness work and reflexivity to be able to engage with communities in a culturally relevant and responsive way. And I will talk a little bit more about this in a bit. And most importantly, it requires action. It requires that we're willing to do the hard work of, you know, maybe taking a step back and recognizing I'm not the best person to be communicating this. It requires, as I said, humility to say, I'm sorry, I messed up, I need to learn and do better. All right, so I want to share some examples of culturally relevant strategies and, you know, from my own work, from the work of others. There are many different strategies and tactics that you can use. So it's really, that's where the self-awareness, the reflection, the reflexivity about your audience and yourself is really important, because what tactics and what devices you use are really going to depend on who your audience is, what your goals are, what your message is. So I'm just gonna give you a flavor of some of the things that I and other colleagues do. The first thing is that you can make science local. You can really bring science to what's going on locally at the moment. So these are kids who are part of a Boys and Girls Club program. And what you see in their hands is a hand washing station that uses little water, little soap, and no energy. And they created this as part of an educational program that was teaching them about principles of engineering. But most importantly, they built this hand washing station after Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico in 2017, and it was impossible to get access to water and soap. Lines at grocery store were 12 hours long. There was no power. There was an island-wide blackout. My father was without power for 6 months. And so washing your hands to prevent disease was very hard. So we were not only teaching these kids about engineering, we were teaching about engineering that was relevant to what was happening in their life at the moment. So this is one way in which we can make science relevant to what's happening, the local realities of communities of our audiences. We can also communicate science in the language of our audience. This is Corey Gray. Corey Gray is a physicist, and this is his mom, Sharon Yellowfly, and they are members of the Blackfoot Siksika Nation. And Corey, what you see actually behind Corey, is the arm of the LIGO Observatory in Eastern Washington State. And Corey is a scientist there. This was the facility that detected gravitational waves for the first time in, I want to say 2017, I can't remember the year. But he was part of that team that made that observation. Gravitational waves was something that Einstein had predicted, I don't know, like 100 years before. So this was a really big deal. It was a really important discovery or observation. And as such, LIGO was creating press releases and preparing to like make a big splash announcing this discovery. And because Corey was part of the team who made this observation, he thought, well, these people are translating the press release about what we've just observed into 25 plus different languages. What if we translated that into the Blackfoot language, which is an endangered language because of colonialism? And so that's what they did. His mom, Sharon Yellowfly, happens to be one of perhaps a handful, like a few hundred people that still speak and can write this language. So he worked with her and others to translate this discovery that Blackfoot scientists have been a part of into their language. And so he was making it accessible to them. It was also a signal of your community, my community, is part of this discovery. There are a few other notes that I want to say about language. Avoid jargon as much as possible. And this is true when even if you're talking to scientists, like there are certain technical terms or jargon that you have to use. They're a really important part of your research. So if you can't avoid jargon, you can't always do that. Make sure that you define it. Make sure that you make sure that people understand what it means and why it's relevant. But we don't need fancy words. We often don't need fancy words. And also, if it's appropriate for you to do so, use local language, use vocabulary. It's like slang. You can use pop culture references that really helps connect people with the concepts, with the ideas. It helps connect science to the things that they already know, that they already enjoy. So this is something that you can really, really lean into. Another strategy you can use is to find common ground, and this is what Katharine Hayhoe does. She is a Canadian scientist, climate scientist, who lives in Texas. She also identifies as an evangelical Christian, and so she really uses her identities and her beliefs, her faith, to connect with communities who, if you say climate change, they're like, nope, nope. For whatever reason, I don't want to talk about it. It's not something that aligns with my values. It's something I don't believe in. No. If she talks about climate change, it closes the conversation. But if she talks about her faith and how her faith says that we have to take care of the planet and we have to be stewards of natural resources, that opens the conversation. So she really uses, in her case, her common faith with other folks to talk about climate change and advance conversations that can often be, tense or controversial with certain audiences. Something else that you can do is connect science with your audience's life experiences. Make sure that they see themselves in what you're communicating. So I'm going to show you a video that is from a project that I've been doing my team and I have been doing for the last 3 years. It's a project called Aquí Nos Cuidamos, which translates to Here We Take Care of Each Other. And it's a community engagement project that has focused on promoting COVID prevention, vaccination, mental health, overall community wellness in different marginalized communities in Puerto Rico. And I'll talk a little bit about it after I show it to you. The video is in Spanish, so the words that you will hear are in Spanish. It's also in sign language, and it's captioned in English.
La pandemia de COVID-19 nos ha forzado a vivir tiempos duros, complicados y hasta desesperantes. Nuestros hogares, nuestras comunidades, nuestros corazones, nuestras mentes y nuestros bolsillos han sufrido mucho. La COVID-19 ha retado todo lo que nos hace boricuas. Juntarnos en familia y con amistades, hacer el bembé, chinchorrear y hasta darnos un abrazo. Cosas que antes eran parte de nuestra vida diaria, hoy nos ponen en riesgo de contagiarnos con el coronavirus. Pero la ciencia nos enseña que, aunque tengamos que modificar nuestros hábitos, no tenemos que perder nuestra esencia boricua. Si seguimos practicando las medidas de prevención con la estamina y el compromiso que nos distingue, lograremos volver a una cotidianidad. Antes y después de vacunarte, ponte la mascarilla sobre nariz y boca y mantén al menos 6 pies de distancia de personas que no vivan contigo. Desinféctate frecuentemente las manos con agua y con jabón o con alcohol 60% más. Evita las aglomeraciones de personas y los espacios públicos cerrados que no permiten que el aire circule. Y, si te juntas con personas, hazlo afuera o al aire libre. Busca maneras creativas y aprovecha la tecnología para conectar con tu gente, porque es distancia física, no social. En comunidad, con conocimiento y prevención, así es que salimos de esta. Les boricuas tenemos 2 herramientas poderosas y sin iguales para vencer este reto: la ciencia y la solidaridad. Por ti, por tu familia, por tu comunidad y por Puerto Rico, practica las medidas preventivas. ¿Por qué? Porque aquí nos cuidamos.
We launched this video in early 2021 when we were in a very different point of the pandemic, and there was still a need to promote all these preventive measures. And so the approach we took is the images that you see illustrations, but we're illustrating people with different facial structures and different hairs. To showcase the diversity of the Puerto Rican population. You see little homes in the country and in more urban settings that look just like your average house in Puerto Rico. We're using the music. We work with a friend of mine who is a composer, and he lent us music from original compositions that feature Puerto Rican instruments. The words that we're using words like bembe, which means a big boisterous party. That's a word that's very common. Like, vamos a hacer un bembe, we're gonna have a party. This is how we talk in our everyday lives. The video also recognizes how hard the pandemic has been for everyone, but particularly given Puerto Rican culture, where we're very gregarious and we like to hug and kiss to say hello, and we couldn't do that. We were told we couldn't do that. Even with the title of the video and the public service campaign that this video was a part of, distancia física, no social, physical, not social distance, because really what works from the science perspective is to keep physical distance. You can still keep social ties. And culturally, those social ties are very important. So we brought all of these elements into this video and into the campaign to speak directly to different audiences. Importantly, we also chose to make our sign language interpreter very prominent in the video. And that was a conscious decision. If you have ever seen a sign language interpreter, you see them often at government press conferences where they're kind of like sitting or standing next to whoever is speaking. But if you see them in a video, they're this big. And we wanted to make sure that the deaf community saw themselves in this video by making the interpreter as a focal point, really, of the video. We wanted to say, we see you and we want to serve you. So it's really important that you center your audience in any sort of communication, but particularly if you're looking to connect science to their life experiences and their realities. And sometimes you can even bring yourself and your experiences into the conversation if that's appropriate. I want to show you another clip from a film I produced in 2019 where we're interviewing Manu Prakash. He is a bioengineer who creates frugal science, so low-cost tools that anyone around the world can use to feed their curiosity or to actually do science and diagnostics. And in this video, he really brings himself into the conversation.
Most of my childhood was in this small town called Rampur. If you ever watch a Bollywood movie, they talk about this knife called Rampuri Chaku that used to be made only in that region in the country. So I had this strange fascination with manufacturing really early on. And I think I was just very fortunate that the house that we remembered living the most in essentially had an abandoned lab. There were cobwebs everywhere, so there was a sense of mystery to it. I mean, it could be a telescope or it could be a time machine. I mean, I had no idea. We would play with the cows and the animals very much in the same way we would play with this sophisticated scientific instrument. It was just an abandoned space with objects that I could play with, and they were our toys without really knowing what they meant. And my brother and I spent 3 or 4 years just really both organizing that lab and just doing things that I would, from the current standard, describe were quite dangerous. The very first thing I remember making was this devil that during a festival you essentially light up on fire. We made these explosive boats to depict how oil spills actually work. You can see there's a fire theme in my childhood. I think that's when I remember I built my very first microscope, and we didn't have a source of lenses, so I actually stole my brother's eyeglasses. And for a day or two, he was really upset because that was his only pair of eyeglasses. And then I reached high school, and the system works in a very specific way. I mean, in India, tens of millions of kids apply for these exams that you have to pass before you could get into a good engineering school or a good medical school. And these exams were about books. They were not about what I was making. None of my experience counted. And it was a complete U-turn from my personality. I was sitting on a chair for 16 hours a day preparing for that exam. But the only way that I survived was those childhood days came back slowly. And most of what I do in my lab now reflects back on that open-ended creativity and curiosity.
Manu is renowned around the world for this work that he does. He's really famous for Foldscope, which is this origami paper-based microscope. He's won MacArthur Fellow, he is a MacArthur Fellow. He's done TED Talks, and it was a challenge to produce this story because so much has been said and how so many stories have been told about him. And so the angle that we took with this story was really focusing on that background, that open-ended curiosity that he was able to pursue. I'm not from India, I'm from Puerto Rico, but when he talks about playing with cows, I was like, oh, I love cows. So I was able, even though we don't share the same cultural background, I was able to identify with that experience. There's a very powerful line where he said, none of my experience counted. And that is something I think a lot of folks can identify with, especially those of us that come from backgrounds that have been excluded in science. And so that video is part of a broader series called Background to Breakthrough. You can find it in that link. I also have a QR code later where you'll find that link as well. So all of these films are available for free. It's part of my work with the Science Communication Lab and Wonder Collaborative. And everything that we do is open access and free. The last tactic that I want to talk about is reflexivity. And I want to spend some time on this one because it's probably the most important tool that I use. What you're seeing here is a group of grassroots community leaders in Puerto Rico, and what we're doing with our hands, it's the I love you sign in sign language. So this sign, it literally means I love you, but it's also a hello and goodbye. It's sort of like the way people use aloha in Hawaii. That it's like you can use it for many different purposes. So it's very common that if you're talking with a deaf person and they'll saying goodbye, they'll do this. Or it's a way they say hello, and that's what you're seeing us do with our hands here. And these are people that represent, they give you a snapshot of Puerto Rico. Jamilet and Aslin are actually deaf. Mirta and Jeffrey, and is Lucia here? No, Lucia's not in this picture. But another one of our leaders, Lucia, they live in public housing complexes, which are often marginalized, and they're not on the margins, they're actively pushed to the margins of our society. So these are people that really reflect the different realities of Puerto Rico, and I've had the privilege of working with them for the past almost 3 years, and they've taught me a lot about reflexivity. And what is reflexivity? What do I mean when I say that? Reflexivity is the act of examining your beliefs, your practices, your reactions, your motives, and how they influence what you do and think in a situation. And in other words, is asking, where do I stand? From where did I start? And what do I think or do? Or act the way that I do. And it's a really powerful tool that's often used in qualitative research and social sciences, but we don't practice it enough in the natural sciences or the biomedical sciences, for example, where I did a lot of my training. And I want to share, sometimes I think this concept is hard to grasp, so I want to share a case study from my own work to demonstrate what reflexivity is and how valuable it can be in communication and engagement. So as part of Aquí Nos Cuidamos, this project that I've already told you about, I've worked with the deaf community in Puerto Rico. And I came into this work with many different lenses. I am an able-bodied woman so far, that may change. I'm hearing. I grew up in a rural working class community and middle low income household. Spanish is my first language. I'm a scientist, I'm a multimedia producer and communicator. Like all of these identities, all of these lenses influence how I was approaching this work. And in previous video production work that I've done, I'm accustomed to captioning things because it's a good way to make content more accessible for folks. For example, I've heard from people who English is not their first language, that having captions really helps them understand if there's something they don't understand or catch. But a lot of that video production work I was doing was for, it was diverse, it's an international diverse audience, but it's an audience that's mostly scientists, so they mean they're highly educated, and most importantly in their context, they are hearing. And so that led to me making some assumptions. If for this type of work that we were doing for this project, for Aquí Nos Cuidamos, I would caption videos, and that would make it accessible to a lot of people, including deaf people, because on TV you see closed captions, and closed captions are there for deaf people. But what I learned is that due to systemic failures in our educational system and discrimination, there are some deaf people that they don't have the proficiency to read the captions. So their first language is sign language, if they learn sign language at all. Spanish, if they live in Puerto Rico or wherever they live, whatever the language is spoken by hearing people, that's a second language. And our educational system has failed deaf people so badly that they can't even read captions. And so if I wanted to really make content accessible and inclusive of deaf people, I needed interpreters in everything, except that wasn't in my budget. And interpreters can be costly because they do an incredible amount of work. And so I was forced to reckon with all of these failures of mine and the system. And by practicing reflexivity and really centering my audience, in this case, the deaf community, I was able to realize I was wrong. There was a lot I didn't know. We were fortunate that early on in this project, we had brought in interpreters and other folks from the deaf community who guided us through this process and really supported our reflexivity. We continue to seek opportunities to educate myself and my team as well, and found these collaborators in the deaf community. And importantly, we adjusted our budget and we moved some things around so that we could have interpreters in everything. We also had to adjust our workflow because there was an added step of I need to send this to an interpreter, they need to record themselves, and so on. But yet, I still continued to fail. This clip doesn't have audio, but I want you to pay attention to the interpreter. This is part of the mental health campaign we did for Aquí Nos Cuidamos. And there is a voice that's saying, it's important, like take a breath with me, and I want you to pay attention to her. She makes even if you don't understand sign language, she goes like this. She's saying, close your eyes and breathe with me. That's what the voice is saying. Exactly, exactly. The people who developed the script for this, who developed the video, were all hearing people. And I was reviewing this video, it was about a week before we launched, and we were doing like big launch, media campaign, all the things. And I'm watching this and I'm like, oh shit. And I reached out to our deaf partners and our interpreter, and I was like, I just noticed this. I am really sorry. The video would have been as effective if it had just said, take a moment and breathe with me. Did not have to invite people to close their eyes, but as a hearing person, that helps me. Because I can continue listening to someone and hearing someone who's guiding me through the breathing exercise. It's fine if I close my eyes. But if you're a deaf person, you can't see the rest of the instructions. You can't understand it because you can't hear. And so there are a few things that I learned from this. I told you, it's not a matter of if, but when you will mess up, how many times you will mess up. And messing up is part of the process. When you are communicating, when you're engaging with communities, you're building relationships, and relationships are messy. And so messing up is part of the process. And so that's why reflexivity, taking this active step of constantly asking yourself, where am I coming from? What's motivating this? How can I build that empathy to think about things from the other person's perspective? How do I build that better understanding? That continuous process has allowed us to, in this particular case, be better partners for the deaf community, but just be better communicators. This experience has transformed how I think about my communication. I've realized I've been lying to myself. I've been saying like, yeah, I use science communication to make science more inclusive and equitable for hearing people. I still have a lot of work to do for deaf people and people with other disabilities. All right, so to summarize, I've told you and given you examples about culturally relevant science communication and how you can use that to connect science to an audience's culture, their context, their identities, their previous knowledge, and many different things. I told you about how it can make science pertinent, more accessible, inclusive, more actionable, really how people use science as a tool to protect themselves from COVID, to care for their mental health. It can also make people feel seen. It's a way to engage different publics and to counter stereotypes and change perceptions about scientists. That's what the Background to Breakthrough series is really about. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this example session, there are many different tactics that you can use. So it's really important that you think about who's your audience, that you practice that reflexivity, that self-awareness, that you engage with that audience to make sure that you're picking the strategies that are going to serve them and you better. I wanted to share a few lessons that I've learned. I'm a scientist by training, so all of this I've learned over the years and through my practice. This emphasis on being responsive to people's culture, it can really help in so many other areas, in your interpersonal relationships, your professional relationships. So it really adds a lot of value to other aspects of your life. For me in particular, as somebody who grew up in rural Puerto Rico, not seeing herself represented in science, not knowing that I could be a scientist, culturally relevant science communication really helped me harmonize science and all those different identities that I was often told, like, you can be a scientist, but don't like turn it down on the Puerto Rican, like you're being too Puerto Rican. Like for a long time, I felt I was getting that message, and culturally relevant science communication has really helped me bring my full self to science and realize those people that were like, turn it down on the Puerto Ricanness are wrong. It's allowed me to really tap into my background and my experiences, particularly in the community work that I do. So much of my experiences growing up with community leaders around me. That's been so helpful and so valuable in building relationships and finding common ground with people that, my experiences are very different from mine, but we can find common ground in certain experiences we have gone through or values that we share. And I think most importantly for me, it's really allowed me to put science in service of communities that I care deeply about, and it's helped me connect with communities, and this is something that really motivated me going into science communication, and I'm really privileged to be able to do this work. All right, some resources. Inclusive Science Communication, inclusivescicomm.org. It's a website, it's a symposium, it's really a movement that is being led out of the University of Rhode Island. They have a website, they have a ton of resources. They have a conference that happens every 2 years that I would encourage you to check out. The Center for Advancement of Informal Science Education, they have a series of briefs that are collectively called Broadening Perspectives on broadening participation in STEM. And they have a lot of practical briefs that help you ask, like, what is culture in STEM and who defines what science is? So it really raises some really interesting questions that I think are useful to practice some of the reflexivity that I was talking about. The Journal of Science Communication published a special issue called Neglected Spaces in Science Communication that's fundamentally about inclusive science communication. They have some really great research papers, perspectives that have been quite eye-opening for me. There's this book, Communicating Science, A Global Perspective. You can buy it, but you can also download the PDF for free. So if you just Google Communicating Science, A Global Perspective, you'll find it. It has perspectives from many different parts of the world, especially parts of the world that often are not showcased in science communication and are doing some really great communication work. Frontiers in Communication published a collection, a special issue of inclusive science communication in theory and practice. I was one of the editors for this collection. Also a lot of great papers and perspectives on the practice and research of inclusive science communication. And then last year, I created a course for a platform that's called Lifeology. So they have a series of science communication courses that are all available for free. They're really fun. They're like flashcards. And so I created a course on culturally relevant science communication, and I had a chance to work with one of my favorite Puerto Rican illustrators, so that was really cool. So I encourage you to check it out. And you can find all of these resources and a lot more in this QR code, and I'll come back to this, so you can take a picture, you can scan it now. But I wanted to leave you with one of my favorite quotes. This is from Arthur Ashe, who was an African-American tennis player. And he said, "Start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can." And one of the questions that I get really often in my talks is, I want to do this work, but I don't know where to start. It's really overwhelming, like I'm working with a community that's not my own. And so this is what I would say. Like when I am doing this work and I'm like, oh my God, it's so overwhelming. This is what I think about. I start where I am. I use what I have at my disposal, my knowledge, my networks, my privileges, and I do what I can. And that's all it takes. Or that's all it takes to get started. If you really want to make science communication and science more inclusive and equitable, we're working on a problem that it feels intractable. It's systemic, so it's really hard. So the most important thing you can do is start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? I think we have some time for some questions. If anyone in the audience has something they'd like to ask. Yes.
There's a mic coming behind you or in front of you.
Sorry. I was just curious, are there differences enough between Puerto Rican Sign Language and ASL that would be an additional sort of translation or barrier?
Yeah, that's a great question. ASL is the base for Puerto Rican Sign Language, but if you speak English, you can understand someone from Australia or, someone who comes from another country and speaks English. It's similar things. There's slang, there's certain variations, but for the most part, it's similar enough that people can understand each other. See a question here in the front and then in the back. Let's go to her in the front.
Hi, thank you so much for coming.
Yeah.
My question is, what experience do you think is the most impactful for you that you've had in working with communities?
I think working with the deaf community has been really transformative. I mean, what I was saying is like there's realization like I've been lying to myself this entire time. It's helped me reckon with the limitations. It's like, you know, I'm only one person, and what I do is really informed by my perspectives and my experiences. So it's really forced me to constantly practice reflexivity. It's forced me to change how I write. You know, like deaf people, they don't, like, I was trained as an academic. I write very long sentences. And deaf people do better if you're writing, I mean, everybody does better if you write short sentences, let's be honest. But that's changed how I write, because one of the changes that my team and I, in our frame of mind that we've gone through is, what if we create content for deaf people? Because then that's gonna serve everyone else. Right now, we've been working with some of the community leaders that you saw in the picture to help them craft these proposals for community science projects. They've identified a need or a priority in their community, and they're crafting a project using human-centered design and the process of science to address that. And you know, with one of our deaf participants, she's really done well with like color coding, like the sections of the proposal to help her navigate, like this is the instructions, these are the examples, and we're color coding everything. And we're like, well, that would work for everyone. And so it's really transformed the way that I think about communication and the failures that I notice constantly, and how much better we need to do in communication to truly serve people. Because, you know, information is power. Information can be the difference between health and sickness, between life and death. And we're constantly leaving out so many people because we can barely do the minimum. So that's been really, really transformative. It's been really humbling, but it's been fantastic. Yeah. You had a question in the back.
Oh, no.
No.
Oh, there we
Now
go.
it is, yes.
What do you think is the role of entertainment in science communication?
I think there's a role, because, you know, like you have to connect science to people's lives, and like, you know, people like sports, people like films. But I think sometimes we focus too much on the, especially nonfiction things, we focus too much on the entertainment, and we're not really, for example, we're not using like evidence-based strategies on the things that we know work. Like somebody who I feel does some of this like edutainment and who's a really well-known science communicator is Neil deGrasse Tyson. I think he's really condescending to people. And I don't like him because of that. I mean, I appreciate his reach and all that stuff, but I wonder, like Bill Nye, you know, there was, I don't know, I think it was last year, in the last couple of years, I think he was on, I want to say the Colbert Show, like one of those night shows, and he was like, you fucking people, like the planet is burning. And it's like, how do you think that's going to lead to a conversation? You know, and so I feel like sometimes it can be counterproductive because edutainment is not taking into account all of these things that we know from the research and practice of science communication. And so I think sometimes I worry that it can be more harmful than good, because, you know, it's good because it connects things to people, to science, to the things that people care about, but it can be really damaging.
Hello, thank you for your discussion. I enjoyed it very much. It seemed like, especially in the beginning of your presentation, there's a theme that's running through there that you didn't talk about it directly, but it's implied, and it's to me it came across as the co-creation of science, which could also lead to the co-creation of communication. Mm-hmm. And so, could you talk a little bit more about the co-creation of science from the beginning, and including your not just participants, but your audience in your questions and moving forward with your science, and how that may impact how that science is communicated later on to certain groups.
Yeah.
And maybe an experience of co-creation of science all the way through the co-creation of communication. I don't know if you have any examples.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have any example of co-creation of science because I'm not doing any research. But for Aquí Nos Cuidamos, we did a lot of community listening sessions. We got together with different community groups, community-based organizations, and we said, we want to do this. Like, we want to create a toolkit that any one of you can use to then go out into your communities and, tell them about like risk and prevention. And so we did a lot of that. We also did a lot of kind of consulting of messaging. Does this resonate with you? This is something that we actually do a lot with the deaf community. There's one of the challenges in translating and interpreting from Spanish to sign language and from any language to sign language is that there are words that don't have a sign. And interpreters have to not just interpret words, but they have to interpret concepts. And so we've had to think about and co-create our messaging. So like, we want to say this, does this work? And it's like, well, no, that sign doesn't exist. Or if I sign that, it's too broad. And so we've employed some co-creation in that with the community science projects. It's where we really lean into that in supporting these community leaders and identifying what is it that they want to do, what tools can they use. And I think, this has impacted the messages that we've put out. But I think one of the things that's been most impactful for me is we hear from these community leaders, like, there's one of them who's told us multiple times, like, I wasn't going to get vaccinated. I was scared of the vaccine. I was worried about how fast it was made. I was worried about, oh my God, what's the word? The side effects. I'm thinking in Spanish and I can't find the words in English. The side effects. And, she said because of this continuous engagement, this partnership that she has with us, she not only is up to date with her vaccinations, but she's gone out to her community to answer these questions. So for me, it's been about, this process of co-creation has allowed us to build their capacity to use science and scientific knowledge to meet the needs of their communities. They are the trusted messengers in their community. Unless they want me to, I don't have a role in going to their communities and saying, here's what you should or should not be doing. So it's really changed our relationship with these community leaders. It's helped us build resilient relationships that can endure me messing up with like sign language and videos. And so I think that offers opportunities not just for communication, but really for research. There is so much of parachute research that's like, I want to do research there. I'm going to come there, I'm going to tell you what questions I'm going to ask, and you're not taking into account, like, what are the questions that they have? What are the assets that they have? They probably know more about their environment than you do. You just got here. It doesn't matter how many papers you've written. You just got here. You don't live here every day. So I think all of this, the lessons that we've learned from the co-creation of communication, science communication, can really inform how scientists are engaging and serving communities. And that's kind of where we're going next. I do a lot of training of scientists in effective communication. We're moving towards training them in like equitable science engagement and partnerships so that we can also build that capacity.
That was a really excellent question and really thought-provoking response. And I just want to thank everyone for coming and invite you all. It looks like we're at time. It's 1 o'clock. So I want to invite you to continue the conversation with Dr. Feliú-Mójer. We have a reception in the neighboring room here that's been sponsored by our wonderful Science Communication Club. Thank you. So please join us. Please stay, mingle, grab something to eat and drink, and we thank you again for coming so very much.
Thank you.